Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or the guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's June 26th, and we have a lot to talk about. Just this past week, it became even easier to listen to the RealTalk MS podcast and all your favorite podcasts because Google released its first podcast app. It's called, appropriately enough, Google Podcasts. Just a while ago, Google announced that they were going to double the number of podcast listeners in the world. And this is a very big step in that direction. The Google Podcast app is smart. It pays attention to which podcasts you listen to, and using artificial intelligence recommends new podcasts that you may not even know about. It works across all of your devices, so you can start listening to RealTalk MS on your mobile phone, stop partway through an episode, and automatically pick up where you left off on your Google Assistant at home. It's incredibly easy to use, and it's going to make it easy for millions of people around the world to discover podcasts. Of course, you'll be able to find RealTalk MS on Google Podcasts, as well as on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and all the online destinations that feature the very best podcasts. And if you're a regular listener to RealTalk MS, then you know that we talk about MS research every single week. I don't think I've ever done a podcast episode that hasn't included some news about MS research, whether it's a clinical trial that's recruiting participants, or maybe we're talking about newly announced results of a clinical trial. But my thesis on the subject is simple. Research is the road that leads to better treatments and ultimately even a cure for multiple sclerosis. And when we talk about MS research, we always talk about the investigators, the experts, the scientists in the laboratories who are achieving these breakthroughs and expanding on what we know about MS. But who are these folks? How do you become an investigator? And why does someone decide that they want to make MS research their professional focus? So I thought it would be interesting to kind of pull back the curtain and look at how a world-class MS investigator is created. You'll be meeting a few guests on this week's podcast. First, you'll meet Dr. Elisabeth Mari. Dr. Mari is the Director of Biomedical Research for the National MS Society, and she's going to walk us through the research fellowship programs that the MS Society sponsors. Then you'll hear from some MS research fellows that I met up with a couple of months ago at the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting. You'll get an idea of the project that these investigators are working on, and what it was that initially drew them to focus on MS research in the first place. But before we meet this week's guests, there are a few other things that you should know about. For a long time, there's been conversation in the MS community about a likely or at least possible relationship between the Epstein-Barr virus and multiple sclerosis. Well, in a study published in Neurology, the official journal of the American Academy of Neurology, researchers examined post-mortem brain tissue from people with MS and people without MS. And they found that while both groups showed signs of the Epstein-Barr virus, the brains of the people with MS showed a high prevalence of Epstein-Barr virus-positive immune cells, while the brains of people without MS showed almost none of these immune cells. Well, these findings add support to the idea that there is indeed a link between the Epstein-Barr virus and MS, and they support targeting Epstein-Barr virus-infected immune cells associated with MS lesions as a potential MS treatment. Atara Biotherapeutics, the company that published this study, is developing 2 therapies to eliminate Epstein-Barr virus-infected B cells in the central nervous system. And this study indicates that they may be on the right track to developing therapies that can induce clinical improvements in MS symptoms. The 4th Congress of the European Academy of Neurology concluded last week in Lisbon, Portugal, where the results of a study were presented that showed that levels of neurofilament light chain are a reliable predictor of progression in relapsing remitting MS, and that the drug therapy Gilenya can reduce the levels of neurofilament light chain for up to 10 years. Now, neurofilament light chain is a protein, and evidence shows that the levels of neurofilament light chain are increased in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid of patients with multiple sclerosis. Because neurofilament light chain is usually only found in nerve cells, but as MS causes the progressive degeneration of our nerve cells, neurofilament light chain is released into the blood and cerebrospinal fluid. And in this study, researchers analyzed blood samples from patients with relapsing remitting MS who were participating in 2 different phase 3 clinical trials being sponsored by the pharmaceutical company Novartis. In one of the clinical trials, patients were randomly treated with either Gilenya or a placebo, and in the other clinical trial, researchers compared the effectiveness of Gilenya to that of Avonex. In both studies, researchers measured the levels of neurofilament light chain in the patient's blood at the beginning of the trials, and then at 6, 12, 24, and 120-month intervals. Then they correlated these measures of the patient's neurofilament light chain with the patient's outcomes in the clinical trials. And this analysis showed that high levels of neurofilament light chain could predict the time to first relapse, the accumulation of T2 lesions, which are the white spots that can be seen on an MRI and represent evidence of MS, and the rate of brain atrophy. Additionally, the levels of neurofilament light chain matched up with levels of MS disability and MS progression. Among the patients who were treated with Gilenya, neurofilament light chain levels were reduced and remained low. In fact, neurofilament light chain levels in the blood after 10 years of treatment were reduced by more than a third. This analysis furthers the case that neurofilament light chain may be a reliable biomarker for MS progression, and you can be sure that we'll be seeing more research being devoted to this topic. Demographics tell us that gamers, people who are passionate about video games, come in all shapes, sizes, genders, and ages. And some gamers have MS, which can make using a game controller much more difficult. Well, Microsoft has developed a solution specifically for gamers whose disabilities get in the way of their gaming. The Xbox Adaptive Controller will begin shipping this fall. It's a gaming controller that features very large programmable buttons and connects to external switches, buttons, mounts, and joysticks to help make gaming more accessible. The Xbox Adaptive Controller is a result of a partnership between Microsoft, the Able Gamers Foundation, the Cerebral Palsy Foundation, and several other gaming community groups. It's completely customizable and can be set up to work with all sorts of external assistive devices that can control button, thumbstick, and trigger inputs just about any way you choose. For example, if it's easier for you to play video games using your feet, this adaptive controller can make that happen for you. It's priced at $99.99, and Microsoft is taking pre-orders for these adaptive controllers now. I'll include a link to the pre-order page in today's show notes. A study with a very long title, The Relationship Between Physiological and Perceived Fall Risk in People with Multiple Sclerosis, Implications for Assessment and Management, has been published in the journal Archives of Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation. And the study makes the case that perceptions of being at risk of falling are as important as the risk of falling posed by the physical condition of MS patients who are experiencing mobility challenges. And this is really interesting. What this study is telling us is that an MS patient's perception of being at risk of falling is every bit as important as their actual risk of falling due to their physical condition. So in this case, research seems to have proven that perception is equal to reality. Impaired mobility, impaired balance, and falling can have an obvious impact on someone's quality of life. Risk factors for falls in MS patients include physiological factors like irregular gait, spasticity, and slow reaction time, but the fear of falling itself is also a significant psychological risk factor. So in this study, researchers looked at 416 ambulatory MS patients in the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. They pre-tested all of the participants, measuring both the physiological and the psychological factors. And each of the participants in the study was asked to keep track of their falls for 3 months. From tracking the participants' falls, the researchers were able to determine who was a recurrent faller, who was actually physically falling. Then the researchers correlated the actual falls with the physiological and psychological testing that had been done at the beginning of the study, and what they discovered was that even if patients had a low physiological risk of falling, so the physical factors that might cause an MS patient to fall weren't there or weren't very pronounced, while a significant percentage of the study participants who perceived that they were at the risk of falling still fell. So for many of these folks in the study, falling wasn't a logical outcome of their physical condition. It was more like a self-fulfilling prophecy driven by their belief that they were at high risk of falling. Now, no one will ever claim that MS is a psychosomatic disorder. It's very, very real. But studies like this serve to remind each of us that our attitudes and perceptions still go a very long way in shaping our reality. Investigators at the University of Southern California are recruiting 400 Hispanics or Latinos who have been diagnosed with MS within the last 2 years to participate in a study examining the impact of genetics and cultural perceptions on disease severity. Participation involves answering questionnaires, watching a short film, and providing a blood sample. Now, participants in this study will have to visit one of the 4 study sites, and that list includes USC, the University of Miami, the University of New Mexico, and the Caribbean Neurological Center in Puerto Rico. So if you're interested in participating, first make sure that you can easily get to one of these study sites. And if you'd like more information or you'd like to sign up for the study, contact Andrea Martinez at the Keck School of Medicine at the University of Southern California. Andrea's phone number is area code 323-442-6817, and you can reach her by email at andrea.martinez@med.usc.edu. That's med.usc.edu. And you'll find a link to more information about this study along with sign-up details in today's show notes. If you're a regular listener to Real Talk MS, then you know that we talk about MS research every single week. Whether it's a clinical trial that's recruiting participants like this one at USC, or maybe we're talking about newly announced results of a clinical trial. But my thesis on the subject is that research is the road that leads to better treatments and ultimately even a cure for MS. But who are those experts in the laboratories who are achieving these breakthroughs that we talk about every week? How does someone become an MS investigator? Well, my guests this week are here to answer all of those questions. In a moment, We'll meet Dr. Elisabeth Mari, Director of Biomedical Research for the National MS Society, and Dr. Mari will tell us all about what it means to be an MS Research Fellow and walk us through some of the very special fellowship programs the National MS Society supports. And then we'll talk to some of those research fellows themselves and find out about the projects they're working on in the lab and what first got them interested in MS research. I don't think that most people would be surprised to learn that the National MS Society funds more MS research than any other non-governmental organization in the world. But what might surprise people is the fact that the MS Society also invests in helping to create some of the best and brightest MS investigators through its training grants and fellowship programs. I'm talking with Dr. Elisabeth Mari, the Director of Biomedical Research at the National MS Society, and, among other things, Dr. Mari oversees some of these fellowship programs and oversees the review of the incoming fellowship applications. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Mari.
Thank you, John. I'm really happy to be able to speak with you today.
Well, just to bring us all up to speed on our definitions, maybe you can begin by telling us what a fellowship is.
Sure. So a fellowship is really anything that's going to provide additional training. So our fellows that apply to our program have what we call a terminal degree. Usually it's a PhD, an MD, or a combination of the two. Some people are really smart and they get 2 degrees at once. And so these are really people that have done that initial kind of training and schooling phase. And they're coming to us now because they're at a phase where they want additional training, and they want to get training in specifically how to conduct MS research, be it basic research or clinical trials, or something in between, could be rehabilitation research. And so we have a large breadth of fellowships to accommodate those.
Tell me a little bit about the importance that the Society places on its fellowship program in terms of helping to nurture the next generation of MS investigators and in terms of giving rise to new MS research.
Right, and I think that's one thing that the Society is really uniquely poised to do, is really to have those investments. We invest in the workforce. We see this as really investing in a person at that early stage, giving them the tools and the training to really become the best and the brightest, and to be doing the best research, to be making those breakthroughs, and really having those transformative moments for people living with MS. And whether it be basic research at the bench or be it something more translational, like our Sylvia Lowry Award, where we train people on how to run clinical trials, it really is giving them sort of the tools and the foundation to have this career, to run successful labs, academic programs, successful clinics, and really go on and cement that commitment to MS research. Because in the world of science, there's so many things that people can look at and explore, and we really want to keep them engaged in the MS movement and in the MS community. And really, this is our first point of engagement for a lot of people with the Society, and so I think it's so important to catch them early and sort of keep them in, we like to call it our MS family, so that they see how the Society can grow them in their career.
So you've already mentioned a couple of different awards, a couple of different types of fellowships. I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit about the breadth of fellowships that the MS Society awards.
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I think that's really, I keep stressing this, it's such a unique thing that we offer. We have our postdoctoral fellowships, which are for fellows that have just completed that terminal degree, be it a PhD and MD, and they want to continue on and do research in the lab. It's 90% research focused, and those fellowships are usually between 1 to 3 years. We also have our Sylvia Lowry Award, and so these are going to be for neurologists that have done their training, done their residency, and are looking to do a fellowship and specialize in MS clinical trials training. Again, these fellowships range between 1 to 3 years, and these are fellows that are usually coming out of sort of the top MS clinics and MS centers. We also have an award which is called our Clinician Scientist Award. And so this is a unique award because it allows applicants with either an MD or an MD PhD to have protected time in the lab to do research and develop their research projects while also giving them time in the clinic so they're still seeing patients and they're still engaged. And what's really great about this award is that it really helps to develop that clinician scientist, that person that's really going to be able to bring things from the bench to the bedside and sort of back from the bedside to the bench. And we also have a Career Transition Award, which is very unique to the Society. And this award, it's a 5-year award. It's awarded to a fellow, someone that could be, say, doing a postdoctoral fellowship or one of our Clinician Scientist Training Awards. And this actually allows for them to make that transition from being a fellow to being an independent investigator. It can help them secure independent funding to start their lab. So it's a 2-year award of advanced postdoctoral training, and it's actually 3 years of a faculty award, which would be similar to a research grant that fellow can then take with them. So if they receive a faculty position at a different institute, they have this money that they can then bring with them and say, hey, I already have this research grant. I can kind of get my program up and running very quickly. And we've had a lot of fellows that have been very successful with those awards. We also have it's a junior faculty award. It's actually the Harry Weaver Neuroscience Scholar Award. And this is for early phase faculty members. So these would be someone at the assistant professor level, no more than 7 years in. And this award provides 5 years of salary support and additional monies to support the research projects in the lab. But this is really for people who are, these are the top of the top. People that get these Harry Weaver Neuroscience Scholar Awards are really the movers and shakers in the MS field, and they have been some of the ones that have made great breakthroughs and great discoveries in the field. So we're very proud of that program and really just the talent that we see through there.
I mentioned when I introduced you that one of your responsibilities is overseeing the review of the incoming fellowship applications that the Society receives. I'm wondering, how many fellowship applications do you typically receive, and what's the process like for selecting the research fellows that the Society supports?
Sure. So our fellowship application we have one deadline a year. This is a little bit different than our research grants and our pilot programs, which have more than one deadline. Our applications are due in August, and then we have a review process in the fall. So it's a very, it's a very competitive program. We really look at these applications and these applicants in a few different areas. As I said previously, the fellowship is really about investing in the fellow. And that is something that we really do consider heavily. We also look at their training plan, their mentor, their environment. So what type of research are they going to be doing? What are they going to be exposed to in their training environment? Are they training with an MS investigator who's going to have access and collaboration? And then the fellows are typically notified in sort of the winter, I would say January, February time, and then those fellowships would start that following summer in July. Typically, on average cycle, we usually receive between, I would say, 90 to 100 applications, and that's across all of our programs.
I know that every couple of years, the Society convenes something called the Tyson Fellows Conference. I wonder if you could tell us what that is and how it supports the development of an MS investigator.
Absolutely. So our Tyson Fellows Conference, as you mentioned, happens every 2 years, and this is a conference for our fellows. It's a scientific conference. All the fellows throughout the Society across all of our programs, be it our clinical training programs, basic science, rehab, wellness, everybody comes together. We have 2 days of scientific talks. There's poster sessions, and the great thing about it is there's a lot of networking. It's done in conjunction with the Society's leadership conference, so the fellows actually get to meet a lot of people within the Society that they may not have been exposed to previously, but they also get to meet other fellows. that are maybe, we're working on something similar and we can set up a collaboration. And that absolutely happens all the time at Tyson. And it's really great for us to see all of the hard work that our fellows are doing and really just keeping them engaged in MS research and, keeping them connected to the society.
So some of that networking that goes on at the conference could perhaps way down the road lead to some collaborations that you can't always foresee at the time, but those seeds get planted at a conference like that. Am I getting that right?
Yes, absolutely. 100%.
Wow, that's great. I talk about MS research pretty much every week on my podcast, and I think that everybody that listens has a pretty clear idea that there's some amazing stuff going on, that the society is supporting, that research being done all over the world. But I don't know that we really get a chance to kind of part the curtain a little bit and see where some of the talent, some of the brilliance that ultimately manifests itself in these projects, where it all begins. And I want to thank you so much for spending a few minutes taking us through the initial steps of how a life-changing breakthrough may get its very start through some of the fellowships that the society offers.
Yes, thanks, John. It was great to talk to you, and I hope that it was informative.
This past April, while I was at the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting, I found myself in a room with several MS research fellows. So I took the opportunity to sit down for a brief conversation with a few of them, and I thought you'd like to hear firsthand about some of the specific research projects that they're working on and what it was that first attracted them to doing MS research. I'm here at the American Academy of Neurology annual meeting, and I'm sitting in the midst of current and future MS research fellows. In fact, the gentleman I'm sitting next to is Hadi Magzi, who is a research fellow. And why MS? How did you pick MS as a path?
So that's a very good question. I've been doing MS research for the past 12 years. I do not look that old, and I'm not that old. So soon after I started university, I was looking for research projects. I happened to be a neurology clinic, and I happened to see a bunch of MS patients. And that started the question of why these young people have disability, what's going on. Started asking questions. Nobody had really a lot of answers for me. At the time, there were few treatment options available. To this date, we still don't have an exact idea how and why and who gets this disease and all that. So a huge, big mystery. And if you contribute to understanding it a little bit more, I think this is hugely rewarding because it's younger people, and then you'll be able to help them to live their life to the fullest. So since that moment, I have been doing MS research in different areas. I've been doing different parts of research in different parts of the world, in Iran, in Italy, in the UK, on the East Coast, on the West Coast. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about anything you might be working on now or in the near future?
So, right now, for my fellowship, we'll be looking at the gut microbiome, which is a hot topic in just medicine in general, not just MS, and how these little bacteria in your gut change your health in general. On the side, I'm also doing some other research with TNF inhibitors. So TNF inhibitors are a class of medication that they treat some other autoimmune diseases. As a side effect, they sometimes cause MS-like disease. And if you give this medication to MS patient, they get worse. Nobody still understands what's the exact pathophysiology of it. But I think this has a lot of potential in terms of there's one medicine that causes the disease and makes the disease worse. And if you understand what this one medication does in the body, you may be able to understand more about pathogenesis and how this disease is behaving. And then you potentially can develop drugs to reverse that effect.
One of the things we talk about on the podcast is how the accelerating changes in technology lead the way to faster scientific discovery. because you have tools that you didn't have before. How do you see that impacting MS research in general?
It's huge. Like with the gut biome, for instance, the technology that is available for us to see what types of bacteria, billions and billions of bacteria, and how to analyze them. Like our brain cannot analyze it. You have to use computers to do that. Or when the genetic testing gets so cheap that you can easily access it and then see like how does that interact with your disease, with the MRI, with this and that. And this gives us a lot of insight about like how things are. And this is just like a little bit of like things that I'm involved in, but I'm pretty sure there are like way more other technological advances that are helping us understand MS better.
I'm chatting with Krista Crisco, another MS Research Fellow, about some of the work she's doing at UCSF. Krista, why don't you tell us about the projects you're involved in?
Hi, I'm a clinical research fellow with Dr. Wobont at UCSF. So I'm working on a lot of her studies, both in adult and pediatric MS. In pediatric MS, we're looking at the use of newer therapies for MS in children and comparing the effectiveness of those treatments in the real world. In adults, we're doing a number of clinical trials, including large multi-center trials, including for fatigue in MS, as well as a single-center pilot study looking at N-acetylcysteine in progressive MS fatigue.
Why MS? How did you decide to go down the MS path in your research, so to speak?
So I was always interested in MS ever since medical school. I remember having patients with MS and actually pediatric onset MS as a first-year medical student, and seeing them and learning about the new treatments that were being studied was really exciting to me. And then I went into neurology and just continued to enjoy the neuroimmunology aspect of neurology, and then I'm focusing on MS.
I'm talking with researcher Maureen Mealy, and she is looking at quality of life issues. So I'll let her tell us a little bit about how you got here and what kind of work you're doing.
Hello, thank you. So again, I'm Maureen. I work at Johns Hopkins, and I have been working, I'm a nurse by training and have been at Hopkins for my whole nursing career in neurology since 2000. And at 2010, I made the transition to neuroimmunology and was mostly involved in clinical care at that point. And then more recently in the last, I've been in neuroimmunology since 2007, and since 2010 I've been more focused on research rather than clinical care, and decided to pursue a PhD at Johns Hopkins School of Nursing, and so that I could independently investigate things that are important to me, which I believe are things that are important to the patient. It's more focused on quality of life issues in neuroimmunologic disorders, and so I'm currently recruiting for a study that looks at a novel technology for central neuropathic pain, and in the midst of recruiting now, so that hopefully I'll be done with my PhD in another year. So I'm trying to get it in 4 years. We'll see what happens.
That's great. So tell me a little bit about quality of life issues as they relate to MS patients. What kind of things do you think about? What kind of things do you look at?
Well, there are so many quality of life issues. There's bowel and bladder, pain, fatigue, cognition, and others. And really it's just a matter of figuring out which ones are most important to the patient, because oftentimes the practitioner addresses the ones that they know how to do. They might know how to intervene on pain, but the problem that the patient's experiencing on a daily basis is sexual dysfunction. And so if the practitioner doesn't ask, oftentimes the patient doesn't bring it up. And so it's really trying to figure out what is at the core of what's interfering with patients' ability to do what they want to be doing on a day-to-day basis. And there's also, I've been doing some research on symptom co-occurrence, which the idea of it is that to address only one symptom in a disease that causes so many symptoms that all affect each other doesn't have as big of an impact on quality of life as kind of more holistically approaching the patient and trying to figure out what could affect other symptoms and then go after that symptom, if that makes sense.
It makes complete sense. And I think it's so important, too, because, sometimes from a clinician's perspective, quality of life gets measured differently than it does from the patient's perspective. And a lot of times it rests on things like physical disability, when in fact that patient is more worried about things like fatigue or things like cognitive decline or sexual dysfunction. And I'm so glad to hear that that is at the top of your list.
Well, yes. I mean, really all of the symptoms, like I said, are affecting each other, affect each other. And then even before that, everybody's where people are coming from socially, psychologically, also impacts their symptoms and how they experience them. And so it's just a very multifactorial issue that oftentimes is looked at singularly. And so I'm doing what I can, trying to do my part to try and make people more aware of the breadth of the issue.
Well, we appreciate how you're looking at it and all that you're doing. Thanks so much, Maureen.
Thank you.
Well, that's going to wrap up this week's episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, I invite you to do so. You can find Real Talk MS wherever you find the best podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, the new Google Podcasts app. And if you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.